In the sea, just a few kilometers away from America, a Soviet submarine was hidden underwater, completely ready to attack. It was at this moment that the U.S. Navy discovered it and threw small bombs into the water to bring the submarine to the surface. The Soviet submarine, which had lost contact with its headquarters thousands of kilometers away, was about to launch nuclear torpedo missiles, believing that war had already started. This was the time when tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had reached their peak. Both countries had thousands of nuclear missiles, just a button press away from disaster. The captain of the Soviet submarine was just about to press the button to launch nuclear missiles when something happened that saved the world from destruction. Welcome back, dear viewers, to another episode of Unsolved Universe. This event took place during the 12 days when tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were spiraling out of control. Here's how it unfolded. After World War II, the entire world witnessed the effects of nuclear bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and saw the terrifying power of the U.S. If anyone could challenge America's power, it was the Soviet Union. Immediately after World War II, the Soviet Union was the second country to successfully acquire nuclear technology. They conducted several nuclear tests, indirectly signaling to the U.S. that they were not like Japan, who would remain silent after attacks. This was the time when the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was at its peak. Both countries kept their nuclear weapons ready at all times, whether it was an attack by land, air, or sea. The world knew that if either country launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with nuclear missiles, resulting in a catastrophic destruction far worse than the atomic bombings in Japan. It was feared that up to 70% of the world's population might perish. To make these attacks even more effective, American and Soviet bomber aircrafts were constantly in the air, and their nuclear submarines hid in international waters, just waiting for the slightest signal to launch. In addition, the U.S. installed nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, as both countries were NATO allies and were close to the Soviet Union's borders. This strengthened the U.S.'s position, as attacking the Soviet Union's western part would become easier. When the Soviet Union learned of this, they decided to install their own nuclear weapons closer to America. The best location for this was Cuba, just 200 km southeast of America. At the time, Cuba had a pro-communist government that the U.S. could not tolerate. In America's view, Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union, the very heart of communism. Communism meant that all businesses were under government control, and everyone would receive an equal share, meaning no classes like rich or poor could form. On the other hand, America wanted capitalism to dominate the world, where anyone could run a business and generate profits. America wanted to overthrow the Cuban government and establish capitalism there. However, Cuban President Fidel Castro had the support of the Soviet Union, who supplied weapons to Cuba. But in a secret deal, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev made an agreement with Fidel Castro that the Soviet Union would install intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, in Cuba in exchange for protecting Cuba from any attack by the U.S. This move also allowed the Soviet Union to target the South American region easily. The deal was kept secret, and the Soviet Union began installing ICBMs at various locations in Cuba. However, rumors spread throughout America, and people became terrified, realizing that Soviet nuclear missiles were now just 200 kilometers away from Florida. The White House denied these rumors and assured the public during the 1962 election campaign that they were baseless. To verify the truth, the U.S. Air Force used a spy plane, which captured photos over Cuba. These photos clearly showed medium-range R-12 and intermediate-range R-14 ballistic missile facilities. These photographs confirmed that the Soviet Union was tightening its grip on the southeastern part of America. This news hit President John F. Kennedy like a thunderbolt, and he decided to strike Cuba. The plan was to first destroy the Soviet ICBMs through airstrikes and then capture Cuba, which had been a long-planned operation. However, this plan would have been the equivalent of declaring World War III because an attack on Soviet missiles in Cuba would have been considered an attack on the Soviet Union itself. If this happened, both countries would have gone into a nuclear war, a war no one could control. Meanwhile, when the Soviet Union learned of America's intentions, they prepared to retaliate, including the deployment of a Soviet B-59 nuclear submarine. The submarine was ordered to stay hidden in the depths of the Caribbean Sea near Cuba. The crew of the submarine had full authority to launch nuclear torpedo missiles without needing permission from Moscow if war broke out. The U.S. Navy suspected the presence of the Soviet submarine in the Caribbean and dropped depth charges to signal it to surface and identify itself. These depth charges were anti-submarine weapons that could destroy the entire submarine if detonated too close. The captain of the Soviet B-59 submarine, who had lost contact with Moscow, thought that war had begun and decided it was time to launch nuclear torpedo missiles. Although the crew had full authority, 3 officers on the submarine had to agree before launching the nuclear torpedo. 2 officers supported launching the missile, while one, Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov, disagreed, arguing that launching the missile without confirmation of war would be too risky. This debate lasted for several minutes, and eventually, they decided to bring the submarine to the surface to re-establish contact with Moscow and assess the situation. At that same moment, a meeting was taking place between the Russian and American presidents to neutralize the growing tensions. They decided that the Soviet Union would withdraw its nuclear missiles from Cuba, but only if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. This was the deal that was publicly announced, but it was later revealed that the U.S. had secretly agreed to withdraw its missiles from Italy and Turkey as well. The Cuban Missile Crisis, lasting 12 days, was a time when tensions reached such heights that both countries sent their nuclear missiles into space. The idea was that if the world survived and war didn't start, the missiles would be destroyed in space. If they didn't survive, the missiles would target their designated targets on Earth. After the crisis ended, the Soviet B-59 submarine surfaced, re-established contact with Moscow, and received orders to return to the Soviet Union. Historians believe that Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov was the person who made the decision that saved the world from nuclear war. Without his decision, the nuclear war would have been so intense that humanity might not have survived. We hope you like this video. See you in the next amazing video.